Hi, APES classes. We are in the home stretch for getting ready for this exam, and I think this is the last real test prep assignment that you will have. This is the questions that you answered last week, where I try to simulate what it's like to write an experimental design question and sort of trying to make you feel a little bit rushed, trying to do too much in 25 minutes. So that was the goal of that. Let's take a look at the answers. You can pull up your answers and follow along, or sort of think through what you wrote and help get some points together. So the first question was, the active ingredients in many pesticides are chemical compounds that kill organisms such as insects, molds, and weeds. Proponents claim that the use of pesticides improves crop yields and thus protects the land and soil by reducing the conversion of forests and wetlands to cropland. Opponents of pesticide use claim that pesticides degrade water and soil quality and that other modern agriculture techniques and practices are responsible for the improved crop yields in recent years. So, design a laboratory experiment to determine whether or not a new pesticide, product X, is toxic to minnows, a type of small fish. For the experiment you design, be sure to do all of the following. The first thing you need to do, and this is sort of how I imagine yours will be laid out, is state your hypothesis. So the things that it wants you to sort of focus on and make sure that you include it. And it doesn't give you a specific example, but that your hypothesis must predict a relationship between product X and minnow health. So somehow you have to connect those two things. The prediction must indicate a specific direction of change for each variable. So let's keep this in mind. So such as an increase, we can't just say product X will kill minnows. It's not enough. An increase in product X concentration will result in increased minnow mortality. So it's showing an increase in X will cause an increase in minnow death. So you're sort of talking about the direction of change of both variables. Keep that in mind. You're going to have two variables on your test, so you're going to want to show the direction of change. And or does decreasing exposure to product X result in increased survivorship of minnows? Less product X, more survivorship of minnows. You can also state a null hypothesis, and we did this back when we did our car lab, in which you predict no relationship between product X and minnow health, such as changing the concentration of product X has no effect on minnow health, or increasing exposure to product X does not change minnow mortality. So describe the method you would use to test your hypothesis. So this is 1 point. A point is earned for a correct method that indicates the manipulation of the independent variable, product X. So how did you manipulate it? Did you increase it? Did you decrease it? And this is important because this is in both the experimental design questions, and I've not seen this anywhere else. The method must include a minimum of 3 experimental groups, one of which is not exposed to product X. So you need one group that's your control that's not exposed at all, and then 2 other that are manipulated. Think of the ants that count video that we watched. One, they put stilts on the ants, and one, they put stubby legs on the ants. So that's significant, and I saw that in both. So note that, because that's the first time I've really paid close attention and seen that they really want 3 experimental groups to be talked about. Keep that in mind. If there's a way to do that, this is in both of these questions. Identify the control. So your control is whatever group you didn't do anything to, without the presence of product X is your control. What is your dependent variable? So how are you going to a measure of minnow health as a dependent variable? Are you looking at how many die? Are you looking at something else that you're noticing about these minnows? Their respiration rate, their reproduction rate, something along those lines. Mortality is a pretty easy one to look at in terms of pesticides. Describe the experimental results that would lead you to reject your hypothesis in part A. So be specific. A point is earned for a correct description of experimental results that include minnow health measurements that contradict the prediction of the hypothesis stated in part A. So if you said that increased exposure to product X will cause an increase in minnow mortality, and then if you did the experiment and you increased product X and it did not impact minnow mortality, that would be experimental results that would reject your hypothesis. Talks about if you did an incorrect hypothesis, like they sort of don't put you in double jeopardy. But the idea that, here's what I said, I will increase this pesticide, more fish will die. If you increase the pesticide, and the fish don't die, that would reject your hypothesis. And that happens. It doesn't all, not all pesticides are automatically bad for the whole environment. One strategy for dealing with agricultural pests is integrated pest management. This is where we use sort of pesticides as a last resort and all these other things. Describe integrated pest management. What is it? As a part of your description, include 2 specific pest control approaches that are part of IPM. So 1 point can be earned for a description of integrated pest management that demonstrates that you know what it is. Integrated pest management uses a combination of biological, chemical, and physical, 2 of the 3 means to control the pests. You didn't have to have all 3. You could just say 2 of those possible 3 to get credit. Integrated pest management is used to reduce or eliminate the use of pesticides. Remember, you can still use pesticides in integrated pest management, but it's sort of the last resort. Integrated pest management is used to reduce pest populations to acceptable or tolerable levels. Then, let's take a look at this. These are things that you can do that are pest control approaches that are part of IPM. Introduce, attract, or create habitats for predators or pests. Introduce parasites that feed on the pests. Introduce diseases or disease-carrying bacteria to kill pests. Vacuum pests from crops. Rotate crops. Plant multiple crops simultaneously, such as intercropping or polyculture. Adjust the planting time of crops. Use pheromones to attract pests to traps. Spray crops with hot water to scald pests. Introduce sterile males into the pest population to decrease their reproductive success. Use narrow spectrum or less persistent pesticides. Spray crops with soap solutions. Use noise to repel pests. Cultivate pest-resistant genetically modified crops. Use physical barriers to prevent pests from reaching crops. Other appropriate examples may also earn points. Please think back to the Biggest Little Farm. You're going to have something on agriculture. I'm sure of it because it's one of the biggest units that we technically covered. So, farming, think Biggest Little Farm, and I think you're going to find your answer there. Identify one environmental benefit of using integrated pest management. It must be environmental, so be careful when you're reading. When it says benefits, make sure you're listing the right kind. So environmental benefit, it cannot be an economic or societal benefit. You can't say we produce more crops. That would be a societal benefit. So be careful with your wording because I know you know the answers, but if you quickly just think benefit and you don't go specific, you're gonna miss that point. Reduces the introduction of pesticides into areas other than farmland. Reduces incidental killing of non-targeted organisms, things like our bees and spiders and ladybugs. Reduces soil compaction by pesticide application equipment. Reduces carbon dioxide emissions from pesticide production and application equipment. Reduces erosion. Reduces bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Reduces genetic resistance to pesticides, and then other examples. 2 agricultural practices other than those involving pest control that increase crop yields. The following are acceptable with suitable descriptions of the practice or how the results would increase crop yields. So develop and plant high-yielding varieties of crops, plant high-yielding genetically modified varieties of crops, plant monocultures, plant polycultures. So things that increase crop yields that have nothing to do with integrated pest management. Rotate crops, intercropping, irrigation systems, fertilizers, add organic materials like compost, keep land in constant production, use modern farm equipment, grow crops in greenhouses, grow crops hydroponically, terracing of slopes, contour plowing, windbreaks or shelter breaks, plow or till soil with lower frequency for low till, so like more tilling or less tilling, slash and burn, plant cover crops, all of those things. So much of that was in Biggest Little Farm. Things that you can do to increase crop yields. And that's the end of that question. Let's hop over to the other one. This is an older question. It's not scored as well as we're used to. Still goes through what we need to learn. So I'm going to try to go through this quickly and meet our time. Oak trees produce large acorn crops every 2 to 5 years and produce few or no acorns during intervening years. Acorns are a critical food for white-footed mice. Mice are an important predators of the pupal stage of the gypsy moth. This introduced insect periodically undergoes outbreaks that defoliate millions of hectares of oak forest, decreasing tree growth, survival, and acorn crop production. An abundance of acorns provides food for white-tailed deer, mice, and D are the primary hosts of the black-legged tick, which carries Lyme disease. There's a whole host of things. So first thing they want you to do is to diagram a food web on the relationship of the organisms. And I know that this was hard to do when you were typing, so you won't have to do something complicated like typing. I don't think they would ask you to diagram a food web, but the important things are is the gypsy moth is eating the oak tree, the white-footed mouse is eating the oak tree, the tick is on the mouse and the deer, and that you have the direction of the energy arrows appropriately. I can't guarantee it. I don't think you'll have a food web to do, but I just threw this one in because it was experimental design. The second question, let's go back to see what the question is. They don't organize these as well. Design a controlled experiment that tests the relationship between acorn productivity and gypsy moth population. Include the hypothesis that the experiment tests. Back in the day, there used to be these like bonus points available in here. You don't have those anymore. It's spelled out so much clearer. But the hypothesis is supposed to answer the question, how are acorn production and moth population related? And so what they're looking for is a change in moths leads to a change in acorns. A change in acorns leads to a change in moths, or that there is some sort of null hypothesis. So here's some examples. If the number of gypsy moths increases, then the number of acorns will decrease due to defoliation and stress on the oak trees. If there's a decrease in gypsy moths, there will be an increase in acorns. An increase in acorns will lead to an increased mouse population, which will decrease the moths. If the acorns increase, then the mice will preferentially eat the acorns, leading to an increase in gypsy moth population. Or you can do a null hypothesis, like we talked about. And then the experiment, which clearly indicates measurable over a reasonable amount of time. Keep this in mind with your question that you're answering. Make sure your time frame is acceptable for what you're testing. You're dealing with trees and acorn cycles. Saying that you're going to measure this over a week, you're not going to notice a difference. You need to have at least one full cycle of oak trees for this experiment. So think about whatever your experiment and make sure your level of time is appropriate for whatever you're measuring. A clear indication of what your control is, and this elaboration point is not a valid thing for what we're doing. It just means that if you gave extra information, you could get an extra point. They're not going to do that on your test. I know that. That's an old school kind of apes thing. For experimental design, in this type, the student is doing a more traditional type of experiment where there's at least one control and one experimental site designated. A variable is manipulated at the experimental sites. And here again, need at least 2 sites and a true experimental control. Keep that in mind. It seems that the APES test is really looking for 3 different things when you're doing this. So you can manipulate the moths. You can have a count of the moths, either natural or in the lab. Count the acorns over at least 1 cycle. You can manipulate the acorns, natural sites only. Count the mice and count the moths over at least 1 cycle, 1 measurement period. But keep in mind, they're looking for you. Both questions look for you to have 2 sort of experiments and 1 that's controlled. You could also do an observational experiment instead of in a lab. So this type of experiment, the student, you're not manipulating a variable, but making long-term measurements and doing statistical analysis to determine if there's any correlation. I think you're going to be here in the experimental design type of question, but they could throw you for a loop and do an observational one. So I just wanted to make that where we have these 2 sites. We're just going to observe what's going on at site 1 and site 2 and then compare them. And again, it goes on with that elaboration point, which isn't really valid for us. And then it talks about the last part of this question said, let's go back quick. A strategy that uses integrated pest management for the control of black-legged ticks, and integrated pest management. So things that you could manage the habitat. So shorter grass, brush reduction, ticks like those taller grasses, rotation of pastures and runs, expose areas to more direct sunlight, higher soil temperatures, control burning of brush, introduce a tick repellent plant, biological controls, a tick predator like birds, wasps, chickens, a disease that will affect only ticks. Sometimes you can introduce things that we don't even know if they exist, as long as it's a rational thing. I don't know if there's a disease that affects ticks, but you could go ahead and say that.